Good morning. Welcome everyone to our webinar today, Oracle Database and IBM PVU licensing. And hopefully we'll live up to the tagline, making the complex simple. My name is Sumin Chen. I'm just going over a couple of the introductions, and we'll introduce you to Andy Ridgers, who will be doing the presentation today. We will have a recording, so you will get an email afterwards, and there will be a recording. Everyone starts on mute, but during the presentation, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and we can respond to that, or the questions box, sorry. Let's see what else. At the end of the session, you can raise your hand, and we will unmute you, and you can ask verbal questions directly. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Mr. Andy Ridgers. Andy.
Thank you. So today we're going to talk about Oracle and IBM licensing. There's quite a lot of material to go through. We're going to talk about Oracle first, and then I'll talk about IBM. We've got, I think, about just over 60 slides, so some of them I'm going to skip over, but don't worry about it. If you'd like to get a copy of the presentation, we'll be happy to send it to you at the end. You can just send an email to info and ask for it. So essentially there's two presentations here, Oracle and IBM. They're both structured the same way. We're going to talk a quick review of the database editions, a quick review of the licensing metrics and rules, because those are the complicated pieces, and then talk about a process that you can follow to achieve compliance. So Oracle comes in 4 different editions at the moment. The Express edition is the free to develop edition. Very popular if you can use it, but severely restricted in terms of the resources that you can use and the size of the database that you can apply to it. The Personal edition is basically just the developer edition. And then the two editions that are mainly used for production are the Standard Edition and Enterprise Edition we'll come to at the moment. There used to be a Standard Edition and a Standard Edition 1, but they're no longer supported. They've been replaced by Standard Edition 2. And that's quite much more competent than the Express Edition, but it also has got some severe constraints in terms of the limitations of the things that you can do with it. So again, you can use this for production where possible, but for most people, the serious deployment of business applications is done with the Enterprise Edition. There's no limits on it. The Enterprise Edition is a little oddly named in some ways because the Enterprise Edition itself isn't particularly business capable. It only becomes business capable when you add some of these options and packs. These add all kinds of features to the system that make it a lot more attractive and a lot more reliable. So, for instance, real application clusters is something that allows you to run the database across multiple computers, whereas out of the box, you can only run the Enterprise Edition on a single machine, which is fairly limited. So what we're going to talk about now are the license metrics, how you work out the proper number of licenses. So the Oracle database is licensable by 2 different metrics. One is the named user plus, often abbreviated to NUP, and the other is by processor. Named user is useful when you can count the number of users or the people and machines who are using the database. Anyone who is licensed can access any number of databases. On the other hand, you'll want to license by processor when you can't count the users, because if you can't count the users, you really don't know how many licenses you need to purchase. With the processor, the number of licenses that you need is just simply based on processors. So it's a question of the number and size of the physical hardware, not who's using it. It's particularly useful when you've got internet-facing applications. So what is a processor for licensing? There are 2 different methods used to decide what a processor is. For the Standard Edition, it's based on CPUs, so it doesn't matter how many cores or hyperthreads there are in the processor. On the other hand, for the Enterprise Edition, it's based on the number of physical cores, and that's adjusted by a core factor. And this core factor is in a table supplied by Oracle. So here's some general rules that apply to the different metrics and editions. One is that you always license physical servers. Of course, you can run Oracle on a virtual server, but you never license the virtual server that it runs in. You license the physical server that's hosting the virtual machine. The license metrics are based solely on the characteristics of the physical server and its CPUs and cores. That's unlike Microsoft SQL Server, for example, which gives you the option of licensing by the virtual machine characteristics when you're running in a virtual machine. The database is like, when you install it, you have to have a license for it. But the options and packs are often installed right away because it's just sort of convenient that when you're going to do the installation, just install one massive download rather than worry about adding things later. But you only need to have a license, and you only need to pay for a license for the options and packs when they've been used. So as far as detecting when you need a license, it's a little trickier with the options and packs because you can't just see, oh, the software is installed over there. That's not an indication that you need a license for it. We've mentioned the fact that there's no subcapacity licensing or licensing by virtual machines, and we'll go into that in some more detail in a moment. But that has got implications, especially for VMware, as to what Oracle considers a physical server to be, that you really have to watch out for. So we're going to look at the Enterprise Edition in a little bit of detail. The first method that you can use to licensing it is Named User Plus, NUP. You don't purchase the Enterprise Edition directly, you just have to purchase the appropriate number of named user licenses for the users that are using it. There's a minimum, which is 25 per processor. And even though this is the Enterprise Edition, that's per processor, not per core, because we're using the NUP basis of licensing. What you can see on this slide is an example of the kind of cost that you might incur if you had a machine with 6 processors. Then you'd have to get at least 150 named user licenses, regardless of whether fewer people were using it. And as far as cost goes, you can see that that's going to run you in the neighborhood of 150,000 or so, and then something for maintenance on top of that and annual support. We'll use indicative prices through this presentation, and they're all based on list prices from maybe 12 months ago. Obviously, what you're quoted is going to depend on exactly where you are with your sales rep. The second licensing method for the Enterprise Edition is the processor license type. And in this case, you license all of the physical cores adjusted by a core factor. You obtain the core factor values from a table maintained by Oracle. Basically, some processors are more powerful than others, so they have a different core factor according to that. Again, here's an example. Suppose you have your Enterprise Edition running across 2 different servers, and those servers are using Intel Xeon processors. And in this case, assume that each of those Xeon processors has 4 cores. So in that case, you're looking at 2 servers times 4 processors, which gives you 8 processors. And typically, in the case of a Xeon, the core factor is 1/2. So when you multiply the 8 processors by the core factor of 1/2, you get a total of 4 licenses. So for this kind of machine, you would need 4 processor licenses. And again, we finish here with an example of the kind of cost that you might expect to pay for those licenses. The list price of the license per processor is just under $50,000. You can see that every single processor matters for your cost, and it's not a trivial amount of money. So we're just going to go through the same considerations for the standard edition. Again, we look at named user licenses first. With the Enterprise Edition is 25 users per processor, but the standard edition has a lower minimum of 10 licenses per processor. So you must have at least 10, even if you have the fewer users. Again, we have an example of cost here, and you can see it's dramatically lower than the Enterprise Edition. For a 2-server setup, the same kind that we had before, you need a total of 20 named user licenses for this. Each named user license costs $400 or less. So you have a total cost of well under $10,000 for this system. You can see that this is dramatically less. Similarly, Standard Edition supports processor licensing as well. Again, you need to license all of the physical CPUs, but now we're only talking about the CPUs themselves. You don't have to worry about cores, and you don't have to worry about core factors. There's a maximum capacity which you cannot go beyond. That's one way that the power of this edition is limited. So, for example, using that same hardware that we've talked about before, we've got 2 servers in this system that we're running using Xeon chips that have 4 cores. But the cores don't matter for the Standard Edition, so it's just the fact that we have 2 processors. As far as cost goes, the list price is just under $20,000 per processor. And so you can see that the cost for this is much lower than that for the Enterprise Edition. Just briefly on the Personal and Express editions. The Personal Edition is very simple. It's just a single license for a single computer for one user. It's most commonly used for development. It doesn't offer any kind of processor license type. It's just the single NUP, and so just one person can use it. Finally, there's the Express Edition, which is completely free. No processor licensing, no NUP licensing, nothing at all. Along with it being free, of course, it has very limited resources that it can be used with. So just a couple of notes about the option packs, which we mentioned earlier on. The Enterprise Edition really becomes enterprise capable because of the capabilities in these options and packs. You need these options and packs. Which particular ones you need will depend upon your situation. All of the options and packs are available for the Enterprise Edition. For the Standard Edition, it doesn't allow you to have any of the options and packs apart from real application clusters, which is included. It's bundled, there's no extra cost there. So that's what allows you to run the Standard Edition across multiple machines. Express doesn't have any options. Again, that goes with the fact that it's a very limited edition. The Personal Edition allows all of the options, and that reflects the fact that it's mainly used for development, apart from real application clusters, because it's a Personal Edition for a single machine. Anything that you're developing or trialing in a personal environment can be done for what would be any kind of enterprise environment. The options themselves can be expensive, which is why we emphasized earlier on that you need to understand whether you have to license them. They can be well over the cost of the underlying database itself. We've got an example here. We've been using the same hardware setup all the way through. So we've got these same 2 computers with 2 CPUs and 4 cores in each CPU. Once we apply the core factor, we're looking at 8 processors. The option that we're considering here is real application clusters. That's the option that allows you to run the database across multiple computers. This is going to cost a further $184,000 for the license, and of course a maintenance agreement associated with that. So you can see that the numbers are significant, and this is just one of the options packs that you might want to add to your Enterprise Edition. As I mentioned at the beginning, these options are always, well, pretty much always, quite often installed by default, but the fact that you can discover that they're there does not mean that you have to pay for them. I mentioned VMware earlier on because Oracle is so insistent that what you license is a physical machine. This is just a simple schematic of a possible VMware cluster. So we're showing a cluster which has got 10 blades in it. These are the physical blades, which are practically speaking separate computers. And if you assume that each of these blades has 4 processors, that gives us a total of 40 processors across this cluster. Suppose you install Oracle on one of those blades. You might think, well, that's a physical computer I've only installed on one computer, and therefore I need a license for the 4 processors on that computer. But Oracle looks at it and says, no, the database could be running on any of those blades because that's the capability that VMware gives you. And therefore, you need to get 40 licenses. Of course, that's an enormous increase in cost to you. So that's something you must always bear in mind if you're going to use Oracle in this kind of environment. So now we're going to start the third part of the Oracle presentation, which is working through a process that you can follow to achieve Oracle compliance, to get to the point where you can look at an effective license position, your effective license position. Achieving compliance means that you figure out how many licenses you've purchased, how many licenses you're using, and determine whether or not you're over or under licensed, and make any necessary adjustments that you need to come into compliance. We're going to go through this process as if you were doing it by hand. So you're the license manager and you can talk to IT, you can talk to finance. How do you go about getting the information together so that you can organize and figure out exactly where you may be over or under licensed? The basic process on the discovery side is to find out where all of your database installations are, and then in those, which options and packs are being used. And then you organize that information the way the licensing needs it, which is by the product and the edition, perhaps by the version and license type. And where there's a failover server, perhaps you need to identify those as well, because normally there are separate considerations for those. And then you need to do something on the entitlement side, on the purchase side. You need to get all of your purchases that you've made and organize them in much the same way. Once you have those two things, you can put them together. So what you need to do is you need to get all of those installations and list them out. So your first step is you have to find out where you're running Oracle. You probably contact the IT department, you speak to the database manager or the person who manages the DBAs. In a large organization, you'll probably have multiple Oracle DBAs. Somehow through that process, you reach them and you will gather up all of the information about the Oracle database installations which they're managing and have installed, and return it to you. This table shows the information that you want to collect in a simplified form. You'll gather more details than this, but these are the essential points, and this is a good way to organize it. On the left-hand side, we have 3 columns which identify the database product, edition, and version. The next column identifies whether it requires a license or not. The main reason for not requiring a license is that it's a failover installation, or perhaps it's bundled or developer. And then we have a used column, and you'll notice that we have yes in some of the rows and some other rows are blank. All the database rows are blank because we need the license once the software is installed, but the usage is what applies to the options and packs. We've determined in this case that all the options and packs that are listed here have been found to be in use. Next, we need to know which server is hosting the software. We need to know the name of the server and what kind of server it is, whether it's physical or whether it's a virtual machine. We'll see in a moment why that's important. The final column is the license type. That's not something that can be discovered from the installation, but it is something that you need to specify. You would have one license type or the other, and you have to determine for each installation which license type is being used. You, as the license manager, need to specify that. Perhaps because someone's told you in the past that some purchase was made and that's how it's going to be done. But you might have to figure it out for yourself because you don't have good records available. So now we need to organize this information by servers. And what we're doing is we've modified our table now. So we've moved the server column to the left because essentially that's the main thing at this point. And you'll see there's a column called set, and the set has the server name on it. For the physical rows, which we've shaded in green, the set name is the same as the server name. But down below where the shading is orange, notice that we've put in an extra row that has a server in it, a server called C. You'll notice that C is not running any Oracle software. It doesn't have an installation on it, but we've added it because it is the host computer for the virtual machines below. So that's a separate step that you might have to take with the system admins, because the DBAs typically don't know the organization of the computers. The DBAs know about their database, maybe they can figure out which server it's on, but they don't know the structure of the virtual machines. And even worse, the DBAs might think they know, but the system administrators may have changed things around. So you need to ensure that you confirm the virtual to physical mapping with the system administrators. You need this information because for these machines in the bottom row of this table, the software is running in VMs and you have to get licenses for their physical hosts. In the situation here, we're saying that those two virtual machines are running on the same physical machine. Then we have the identity of the edition, product, and version, which we took from the previous table, along with the license type that we determined. And then on the right, we have some extra columns. On the right side, we have cores, CPUs, and core factor. These are all characteristics of the server, not the software that's installed. The core factor is based on the CPU type. We didn't put the CPU type in here just for lack of space, but you do need to get the CPU type so that you can look up the core factor in the table which Oracle supplies. The license count column is the computed value from the number of cores and core factors. You'll notice we didn't assign any license count to the virtual machines, but we did to the physical host. Once we've finished all of our discovery, the final thing that we do is summarize the installations that we have. What we need to do is summarize the products. So we just end up with a single row for each product with the normal edition, product, and version information along with the license type we're using. The license count column on the far right is the sum of all the rows for that product. We also put the physical server count column here just because it seems to be something that people always want to know. You don't actually need to know that for your licensing result, but it can be useful for scope purposes. So that's the first half of our steps. And now we need to go through something similar on the purchase side. So we start out with all of our purchases. We want to organize this by purchase because that's how your purchase data is going to arrive. You'll see with the enterprise database products that we've purchased those a couple of times on different purchase orders. And with the standard edition, there's only been a single purchase for that. Now, we summarize the purchase information in exactly the same way. So what we can do is we can now merge the data from these two tables together. So we've got all the rows which are common to the two tables. That is the identifier of the product, the edition, product, and version, and license type information. And then we have the different columns from the two activities. From the discovery side, we have the physical server count and the installed license count. And on the purchase side, we have the purchased license record count. Now, at this point, we can see where we are over or under licensed. In this particular example that we're working through, we see for the standard edition database that we have exactly the number of licenses which are required. But in the case of the enterprise edition products, we have purchased fewer than we need. We are either over deployed and need to rectify that, or we need to make some new purchases. Finally, we've talked about all of this as a manual process, but of course a lot of that can be automated. Obviously, if you're going to automate it, you need to make sure that all of the discovery process is automated, or if there are areas where you cannot automate it, that you're very careful to make sure that your manual discovery is complete. This is a screenshot from one of the tools that we provide, And it shows you the very detailed structure of all of the information that we discover for all of these products, including the particular kind of server that you can see, the server machine type, whether it's virtual, whether it's a host, whether or not a license is required. All of that information could and should be discovered automatically. Similarly, we can provide an effective license position, which adds in all of the information from the record, from your purchase records. And you can see in here, we've got a fairly detailed picture with a little bit more information than we provided on those other summary slides that tells you in a very simple screenshot exactly what your current status with licensing is. So that's the first half of the presentation. We're now going to do something very similar for IBM. We're only talking today about PVU licensing. So I'm going to just look at the kind of products that are normally licensed under that scheme. And they're the typical server and middleware products from IBM. You can see the list here: WebSphere, Tivoli, Domino, DB2. So we're going to go through the same kind of organization. Just some general notes first. Again, with IBM, licenses are assigned to physical servers only. Unlike Oracle, IBM allows you to count the number of licenses required by virtual machining, but by virtual machines. Still, technically, the result of that is to assign a license to the physical server hosting that virtual machine. A second thing, metrics under IBM's PVU licensing are uniform. They're based on processor cores. It's not hyperthreads or cores plus processors. It's simply processor cores. Since you can run in either the physical environment or the virtual environment, the meaning of processor core has to be defined for each. In the case of the physical environment, it's simple. It's the real physical processor cores. For the virtual environment, it's whatever the virtual environment presents as its processing unit. It might be called a virtual core. It might be called a virtual CPU. Sometimes it's even called a virtual processor. But whatever they call that unit, that's the thing that you have to count. What that corresponds to physically depends on the virtual machine and how it works, but it doesn't matter for the licensing. It's whatever the virtual environment presents as the number of processing units. As far as the number of licenses that are required, you need to get a number equal to the number of processor cores that you are using, multiplied by a PVU per core number. Processor cores is straightforward. You can count it as we've just described. The PVUs per core, rather like the core factor in Oracle, is in a table supplied by IBM. It's based on the CPU type, and it's also based on the model and the number of processors in the server. Some kinds of CPUs cost more, and the more CPUs that you put in a server, then the more valuable each CPU is considered to be. The normative value is 100. If something is more powerful because it's on a bigger machine or has a more powerful CPU type, then it will be 120 PVUs per core. And if it's on the weaker side, it will be 70. There is also an older value of 50, but that's essentially for much older machines now. Since IBM allows you to do accounting either by physical or virtual, there are two different ways that you can count things. If you're running in the physical environment, you have to use what's called full capacity licensing, meaning the full capacity of the physical server. You need to count the total number of cores on the physical server. It doesn't matter if you think your IBM software is not using much of the physical server. It's on the physical server and you have to license the whole thing. On the other hand, if you're running in a virtual environment, then you just have to count the number of virtual cores. There is a way to get subcapacity licensing even if you're running on the physical server. That is, if you actually genuinely disable some of the cores so that effectively your machine has fewer cores than it was manufactured with. You're also entitled to use the smaller of the numbers. That is, if you count things by subcapacity, it could be that because you have many virtual machines packed into a single physical machines, that counting by subcapacity, counting through the virtual machines, will give you a larger number than the physical capacity. In that case, you're allowed to use whichever is the smaller number. One very important note about subcapacity licensing. In general, subcapacity tends to be cheaper, but not always. However, you're only entitled to the subcapacity option if you're running a product from IBM called ILMT. It's the IBM License Metric Tool. That's something that has to be running all of the time. What it does is at regular intervals, it takes a snapshot of things and saves it. So when IBM comes around and visits you at some point, they can see your patterns of usage over a period of time and charge you for the highest amount rather than just base it on a single arbitrary snapshot. So you have to know about this at the beginning of your deployment, because if you want to take the subcapacity route, you must ensure ILMT is running. Let's just take a look at a quick example. So here we have a server that has 4 processors on it, and each processor has 4 cores. So it's a 16-core physical machine. We're assuming for this example that the number of PVUs per core is 100. That's the value for the Intel Xeon E5. If you're doing it by full capacity, that is licensing the whole machine, you'll need a total of 1600 PVUs, 16 cores multiplied by 100 PVUs per core. On the other hand, let's say that you're running a virtual environment represented by the blue rectangles. So we have 2 virtual machines. One of them is on 1 processor and the other is on 2 processors. The first virtual machine has 4 virtual cores and the second virtual machine has 8 virtual cores. So you're using a total of 12 cores. Now you only need 1200 PVUs rather than the 1600 for full capacity. So if you can achieve subcapacity licensing, you can achieve a considerable saving on the number of licenses that you need to purchase. A note on bundling. Many IBM products come with DB2, their database, which is natural as lots of products rely on databases. Some products also rely on the Tivoli Directory Integrator product. If these products are bundled with the product that you are licensing, then those bundled DB2 instances or Tivoli instances do not need their own independent licenses. This means that when you do your inventory, you need to determine, especially for these products, whether they are bundled with something else, so that you don't think you need to purchase their own licenses, as you don't want to pay for them twice. Another thing to bear in mind is that IBM allows for non-production use of certain products. And non-production means development, testing, staging for deployment. Anything short of total actual production, in fact. Usually, the cost of non-production licenses is 50% of the standard cost. So that's another thing that you need to determine. They're typically different editions of the same product set, and IBM sells them as separate editions. So when you do your inventory, it's something else that you should take care to identify. So now what we're going to do is go through the same process that we did for Oracle to build up our compliance. We're going to go through discovery, we're going to go through purchasing, and then we're going to come up with an effective license position. So firstly, we need to identify all of the products for which we may need licenses. This looks very similar to the Oracle table, and of course it should do. We're looking for software installations, which typically means in a manual process, you go to the IT department, speak to the managers, and they'll find out the actual administrators of that software and get the word out to them to collect the information for you. They need to collect the identity of the product, the edition and version. And then you'd have to determine whether it requires a license, perhaps with their help. For instance, a product might be bundled and they could tell you that it is, but doesn't, and as a result, doesn't require a license. They'd need to identify which server it's on. And by the way, again, we're coloring here just to make the chart a little easier to read. We've distinguished Tivoli, which is on the virtual machines, from WebSphere and Domino, which are on the physical machines. You need to collect the server name and the server type. Of course, if you plan on using subcapacity licensing, you need to know which installations are on virtual machines. We also record the license type, although today everything that we're discussing is the PVU license type. So once we've collected all of that data, we're going to rearrange our spreadsheet again and add the extra information into it, so that we've got all of the information we need about the servers, both physical and virtual, that the software is running on. You can see here that for the WebSphere and Domino products, that these are running on physical machines. We've identified their servers. On the other hand, the Tivoli product, which is running on virtual machines, we had to find out which physical processor they were running on as well. So we've added an artificial row for D, the machine that's hosting those virtual machines for Tivoli. On the right side of this slide, we've added the information about the physical server that we need for the license metrics. We're showing the PVUs per core. As with Oracle, because of the extra space, we haven't shown all of the columns that are critical for computing it. But so you need to know how many processors per server there are, and you need to know the type of these processors. Based on those two factors, you can do a lookup in the IBM table to determine the appropriate number of PVUs per core for that server. Having done that, we've filled in the number of PVUs per core and filled in the number of cores. Keep in mind that at the bottom with the Tivoli products on the virtual machines, those are virtual cores. Finally, we come to the computed columns, the number of PVUs that are required. You can see that here we have two columns as we want to compute them both by full capacity and by subcapacity. In the case of the top rows, which are running on physical machines, there's no subcapacity option. On the other hand, down at the bottom where we have the Tivoli products running on VMs, we've calculated it both ways. So the bottom two rows, computing the number of PVUs for those virtual machines, 100 for each one, as the virtual machine is just a single core. Then on the third row from the bottom, the physical host for those virtual machines, we see that it has 4 physical cores. This gives us a result of 400 for full capacity licensing, but by subcapacity, it's only 200. So we can see that if we're able to apply subcapacity licensing, the number of licenses that we require will be fewer. The last step for this part of the process is to summarize by product edition and version, summarizing across all the servers. The PVU counts in this table are the sums from the rows in the previous table. And again, for the Tivoli product, which are running in VMs, we show the total number of PVUs by both licensing methods. Naturally, if we are running ILMT, we'd want to use the subcapacity number. In general, this table is organized so that you have the full capacity method next to the subcapacity method. And if you qualify for subcapacity, you take the smaller number. It's still a good idea to do this, even if you are not running ILMT, because then you can show your colleagues how much money you could be saving if you did qualify for subcapacity licensing. Again, we're showing the physical server count for completeness, even though it doesn't directly affect the licensing. Now, we need to collect the same information on the purchasing side, and we go through the same steps. First is to gather all of our purchase records together by product and by purchase. So again, we have the identifier of the product on the left, followed by the edition and version information. For this example, as I mentioned, the license type is always PVU, but it makes sense to keep it consistent. And finally, the quantity, meaning the number that we're entitled to because that's the number we've purchased. In the case of WebSphere and Domino, and Tivoli, it seems we've made 2 separate purchases for each of these products. Now that we've got all of that information, we can summarize it again by commoning up everything with the same product edition and version. And we end up with a single row for each product. And we can use this to get to our effective license position. So here we can see that the product edition and version columns were common to both tables, and we've included the different columns from each table. On the discovery side, we've got the physical server information and the number of PVUs required by either licensing method. From the purchase table, we have the number of PVUs that we own and are entitled to use. At this point, it's very simple to see where we're under or over licensed. We can see that on the first 2 rows, we're a little bit under licensed, and in the case of Tivoli, which we're running in a virtual environment, if we qualify for subcapacity licensing, we're in good shape. Of course, if we're not running ILMT, then we are forced to use full capacity licensing, in which case we are under licensed. Just as I showed you with Oracle, our data analytics and Bell Managed Discovery package can automate this entire process for you. The automation needs to discover all of the virtual machines and discover the configuration of those virtual machines so that the information can be accurately collected into these tables, so that when you look at your physical licensing position, you make sure that you've captured all of the appropriate virtual machines. This is a somewhat simplified version, but you can then load this up into your, along with your purchasing information to get an effective license position. So that's the end of the presentation, and I'll hand it back to Sumin for questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Andy. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute you. Just want to repeat that there will be a recording sent out. If you would like a copy of the slides, if you could send an email to info, I-N-F-O, at belarc.com, we will send you a copy of the slides. And just another reminder, we do have a webinar on Microsoft Server and SQL Server licensing coming up the same time next week, Wednesday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Actually, I have a question from Denise. Hi, Denise. Would you like to ask your question?
Well, the one question's already been answered in the chat. Okay. And the other question was just simple. Yeah, so you covered the one. And actually, I need to scroll back up there to see it and make sure I don't have any further question. Just a moment. And now we'll get on that. I understand that. There was a mention of Belarc's discovery analysis tools.
Yes.
You said you have one for each of Oracle as well as IBM.
Yes, and Microsoft's included also. So we do the gamut. We're not really relying on manual methods for discovery and normalization. So this is all automated in Belarc's tools. So we automatically discover your Oracle instances, and as Andy described, also obviously the physical, the virtual to physical host dependencies, the CPUs required. So we do that calculations of the licenses required. We normalize that data, and then we present that to you every day automatically.
So, and then how do you factor in the procurement information?
Yeah, so that can be in a couple of different ways. You could enter that directly into Belarc's tool if you like. It's pretty nice. It's got a nice web-based interface. The data is all normalized, so that's a benefit. Or if you've got an existing purchasing system, we can interface to that. So we've done things like interfacing to SAP, PeopleSoft, other Provence, other kinds of purchasing systems. It can also be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. If you have those, you can input those right into Belarc too. So you can end up with an effective license position.
Okay. And I guess I would also like to ask about, is Belarc an authorized reseller of either of the products, database products?
Oh no, no.
Great. I'm asking to confirm that, right?
Yes, that's right.
Because many people are happy to help you with their licensing,
Absolutely.
only to tell you that you also find they're a reseller. And it's like, well,
That's
I don't
right.
want to talk to you.
We've got a great bargain for you this month.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no. We are software.
I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, so the way we work is we're on the technical side only. So we are discovery, normalization, and effective license position is what we do in software, and our support does that. If there are questions about how should I say, negotiating your Oracle licenses, we work a lot with Palisades. I don't know if you know Palisade Consulting. They're run by a fellow.
I recognize their name.
Yeah, they're run by a fellow that we met a number of years ago. Excellent guy, Craig Garante, who used to, he used to be on the other side. He ran LMS he was with Oracle about 16 years, actually ran worldwide head of contracts and licensing for Oracle for about 5 or 6 of those years. So he ran LMS, was one of his groups. He started Palisades, I think, about 5, 6 years ago, and is really excellent. We've worked with him on a number of our customers, including people like the FAA, people in Latin America. So he's outstanding. So we work closely with Craig, who really offers the experience over the years of how to best negotiate with Oracle. But we supply him with the data, if you will. Yeah, and happy to put you in touch with Craig too, or ourselves. Just shoot us an email and be happy to answer those questions.
Okay, I appreciate that. So what was you said it was just info@belarc.com if we want to set up the slides?
Exactly. Yeah, info at belarc.com.
Got it.
This way.
All right, great.
Great. Well, thank you all. Any further questions? No. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Have a good day.
Great.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you.
Thank you.